Thank you for this opportunity to speak here at this conference. So, the title of my article has been presented already. So, the current COVID-19 pandemic has strongly encouraged us to contemplate the meaning and the importance of resilience. As though dealing with the pandemic itself hasn't been troublesome enough, our society has additionally been challenged by recent terrorist attacks. The first one happened in Nice, France, and the latest one occurred on this Monday in Vienna, Austria. For some present-day philosophers, these violent outbursts caused by members of monotheistic religions, as well as the presence of violence in monotheistic holy scriptures, serve as proof claiming that monotheistic religions are inevitably connected with the violence itself. Furthermore, they claim that violence is inherently connected with monotheistic religions and is seen as their integral part. Religiously motivated violence and its causes have served as a subject of discussion for many years now, and a significant contribution to this discussion has been made by a German Egyptologist and religiologist, Jan Assmann. In his research, he made an important breakthrough from the initial belief that violence toward those who hold different beliefs is a crucial component of monotheism to the period during his research when he realizes that the language of violence found its way into monotheistic holy scriptures via cultures and political thinking, within which this language of violence developed. Assmann's development was accepted by some philosophers. However, others, even some Slovenian ones, labeled his development as unconvincing. They insist on the interpretation of his early essays without considering this key step in Assmann's work. In this article, I would like to present the example of biblical text from Deuteronomy, which is labeled by Slovenian author Istok Simoniti as universal genocidal recipe. Assmann in his later work said that to label this text as such is unjustified. In these turbulent times, this article wishes to highlight the complex relationship between religion and violence with the intention of conveying a clear message. Violence is not the answer, nor the solution, and at the same time, it is not an inevitable consequence of monotheistic religions. An excerpt from the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 20, verses 1 to 18, gives us an insight into the Israelite battle rules given to the people by God himself, which sounds even more ominous. God encourages his people to partake in violence and total destruction of their adversaries. The stated text includes instructions or rules of war given by God to its chosen people. In the initial part, we can see that God encourages its people, more precisely men who are going into battle. In the second part, verses 5 to 9, we can read about the instructions on who to exclude from the fight. And in the third part, as well as the most crucial part, verses 10 to 18, there are specific instructions for pure warfare and enemy management. This third part could be further divided into the general part, verses 10 to 15, and the special part, verses 16 to 18. In the general part, there are rules of warfare with distant cities, where they should first offer peace to the city. If the people decide not to accept that offer, the warriors should kill all the men and seize all the women, children, and cattle. In the special part, there are instructions for warfare with the Canaanites. These cities were in fact given to Israel as hereditary possession, and that is the reason why they have to protect themselves against their traditions, and pagan cults, and that is why it is of vital importance for them to be exterminated. It is important to emphasize that we are not focusing on the historical realization of these instructions. Exegetes are not unanimous when it comes to whether this actually happened or not. Assmann also notes that this Deuteronomistic law of warfare is pure fiction, a law of war which never achieved any validity. So, but nevertheless, this text is still the part of the Holy Bible, and when we Christians read this text, we exclaim this to be the Word of God. And we would like to know why is it that this language of violence is present in the book of divine revelation and how to interpret it. I would like now to present some development of Assmann's thought on regarding the language of violence. His first thesis, which is exhibited in his article, The Mosaic Distinction, Israel, Egypt, and the Invention of Paganism, and is further explained in the book Moses the Egyptian, he stands his ground with the mindset that biblical monotheism is a mere pioneer of religious exclusivity, rather than being the founder of one God. Ancient religions did not pride themselves on being the only true religion. Assmann's initial thinking therefore defends the idea that violent monotheism appears with Moses' differentiation between the true God and the false God. Our colleague, Professor Osritkar, states that the key to understanding Assmann's first thesis is jealousy. Yahweh's jealousy, as well as the language of violence in the Holy Scriptures, was made possible to exist merely because of the presence of other gods. The analysis of Assmann's works shows that his initial theory was made possible because he did not consider the gradual transition of the Jewish faith from polytheism to monotheism through monolatry. He left out a distinctive characteristic from a period in Judaism, which gives us the essential elements in order to form a logical reply to the question of connection between monotheism and violence, also said Professor Osritkar. He states that Judaism's acceptance of absolute faith in one and only God caused jealousy to cease. Language of violence, which can be found in many texts of the Old Testament, reflects the period of the Jewish faith which we call monolatry, the pioneer of which was Moses. It can be observed that the more the religion sinks in the belief that there are no other gods, the fewer instances of violent language we come across in the divine revelation, states Professor Osritkar. Jan Assmann attains this finding in the continuation of his research. In his work Monotheismus und die Sprache der Gewalt, Assmann presents the topic of language of violence in the Holy Bible under a new perspective. He clearly states that the problem in question is not the violence itself, but the language of violence. He contemplates the role of violence topics in monotheistic religions. Considering our passage from Deuteronomy, which was presented earlier, Assmann established that in the first part, the warfare instructions do not deviate from common practice. But in addition, in the second part, the cities of Canaan must be eradicated completely. Assmann states that Canaan here represents the code for Hebrew pagans, therefore for those who have not joined the new monotheistic movement, or rather for those who turned their backs on their own past, in which we can notice that the monotheistic violence is primarily directed toward itself, toward its own members, not against others. Despite the fact that this law of war never really came into fruition, as Assmann says that it is a part of cultural semantics of the monotheistic movement, and with it capable of realizing itself as a historical reality at any given time. In accordance with these findings, he writes that violence in monotheism is not written as an unavoidable consequence, but states that the language of violence originates from political pressure, the very thing from which monotheism wants to free us. In a very anti-Canaanite disposition, which can be found in the text from Deuteronomy, Assmann explains that when we consider this discourse of the Canaanite people, and what needs to be taken into account is the reference to the Jewish pagan past and the reference to the unconverted people in their own ranks. We can now turn to this Slovenian author, Iztok Simoniti, who repeats his understanding of Assmann in his essays and even his forward to the translations of Assmann's works into Slovene, where he blatantly states that in his opinion, Assmann's turn in understanding of monotheism is unconvincing. Simoniti frequently posts comments on topics connected with religion, especially with the Catholic Church, in the Slovenian daily and academic press. Many a time we can observe fury and anger against monotheism from his public opinions, where in his mind, generally speaking, monotheism is the main culprit of all evil. What is especially distinguishable is the extremely negative relationship towards the Catholic Church. I will briefly summarize some of his ideas, which we can find in his text. Monotheism, as well as Christianity, is an inherently violent religion. Modern democracy should merely tolerate religion and church and should not deem them necessary. Biblical language, including orders, threats, and contempt, is the source of hate speech in the West. The Old and the New Testament remain the first and eternal manuals of violence, which is unavoidably transformed into hate speech and violence with the help of the orchestration from the clergy. Each and every individual has a right to hold a personal opinion. However, it is expected that in a free and democratic society, these opinions are to be expressed in a balanced and respectable way if we wish to build a society, or rather a cultural dialogue, in which we will be able to overcome our differences. To conclude, any kind of violence, religious violence included, can be in many cases an expression of weakness and helplessness of a body. By having these aspects in mind, we can interpret recent terrorist attacks, which act as an example of religiously motivated violence, as an expression of vulnerability and weakness. The latter is meant as incompetence to solve conflicts in a calm and respectable way. The violent outbursts of these religious extremists, which we have recently witnessed, are in the majority of cases connected with the radical fundamentalist groups and the influence they have on certain individuals. The response towards this kind of violent outbursts is subject to reality of the human's vulnerability and weakness. In the light of recent Islamic terrorist attacks, expressions of hatred toward Islam, Muslims, migrants, and religion in general appear in public as a response to his violent outbursts. In accordance with Assmann, we can claim that despite the language of violence, which appears in the Holy Scriptures of monotheism, these religions are not inherently violent. In the same breath, we can confirm his emphasis on that there exists a semantic dynamite in these texts. However, it is not led by the hands of the believers, but by the hands of fundamentalists who crave political power and take advantage of violent motives in order to gather and win support and admiration from the crowds. The language of violence is abused in the political fight for power in order to establish a hostile image spread fear and consciousness about being jeopardized among people. The awareness of this fact helps us understand the misuse of the Holy Scriptures. At the same time, it reminds us that in responding to outbursts like this, we cannot fall into the same vicious circle or utilize the same methods as described by Assmann. In order to establish a common dialogue, which is principally defended by Simoniti as well, mutual respect and recognition of every single individual in their diversity is what is necessary. Consequently, what is also needed is acceptance, especially in the context of interreligious dialogue, as Professor Ostreitkar stresses. The primary task of religions, especially Christianity, is that even in challenging times, we should use, if I may borrow Assmann's expression, positive semantic dynamite. The semantic dynamite of all good, which these religions carry deeply within themselves. For example, commandment of love or golden rule. We can witness this kindness or goodness in many endeavors of joint cooperation, unity, and fraternity. Naturally, this is accompanied by respecting our own identity, rights, and freedom. But only with this positive semantic dynamite, with goodness, respect, and love, we are able to crush rocks of violence as well as hatred towards people and religions, and so break the vicious cycle of violence. Thank you.